Welcome to Dark Night. I'm here with you tonight, ready to share stories that drift between reality and the unknown. I know many of you use these tales to fall asleep, so before we begin, please like this video and subscribe to Dark Night for more whispered stories in the darkness. Tonight, you'll hear 3 unsettling experiences while gentle rain falls outside your window. The black screen will keep your mind peaceful as these eerie tales unfold around you. So, get comfortable, pull your blankets close, and let your breathing slow as we journey together into the shadows. Close your eyes and relax. Crazy story 1. The elevator between floors. This happened to me 3 years ago when I was working late at a downtown office building. I was an accountant at a mid-sized firm on the 18th floor, and staying past 9 p.m. had become my unfortunate routine during tax season. The building was one of those older high-rises from the 70s, with narrow hallways and flickering fluorescent lights that hummed constantly, creating an atmosphere that felt tired and forgotten. That particular night in March, I was the last person in the office. Even the cleaning crew had finished hours earlier. The silence was so complete, I could hear the building settling around me, creaking and sighing like something alive. When I finally packed up my briefcase and headed for the elevator, the hallway stretched before me in dim emergency lighting, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward me. I pressed the down button and waited. The elevator in this building was ancient, one of those with the brass buttons and wood paneling that had seen better decades. It wheezed and clanked as it climbed toward my floor, and when the doors finally opened with a reluctant groan, the interior was bathed in that sickly yellow light that made everything look jaundiced. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor. The doors slid shut with their familiar thud, and I felt that familiar drop in my stomach as the elevator began its descent. 18, 17, 16. I watched the numbers count down on the old analog display above the buttons, each floor marked with a satisfying ding. But then something strange happened. Between the 15th and 14th floors, the elevator began to slow. Not the normal deceleration you feel when approaching your floor, but a gradual, almost hesitant slowing, as if something was holding it back. The number 15 was still glowing, but we weren't at the 15th floor. We were somewhere in between. The elevator came to a complete stop, suspended in the shaft. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. I waited for the doors to open, thinking maybe there was some malfunction that had triggered a safety stop at the nearest floor. But the doors remained closed. The number 15 glowed steadily above me, but I knew we weren't at the 15th floor. I could feel it in the way sound traveled, in the subtle pressure changes that tell you where you are in a building. I pressed the button for the ground floor again. Nothing. I tried the emergency button, but it didn't light up. Didn't make the buzzing sound it was supposed to make. The silence was so absolute it felt heavy, pressing against my eardrums. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The elevator wasn't completely still. It was swaying just slightly, as if hanging from a thread in a gentle breeze. Minutes passed. I tried every button on the panel, even the ones for floors I'd never been to. Nothing responded. My cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in the elevator shaft, but somehow felt more ominous now. I was trapped between floors in a building where no one would think to look for me until Monday morning. That's when I heard the sound. It started as a whisper, so faint I thought it might be air moving through the ventilation system, but as I listened more carefully, it began to take shape. It was a voice coming from somewhere above me, seeping through the ceiling of the elevator car. A woman's voice, speaking words I couldn't quite make out, but with an urgency that made my chest tighten. I looked up at the ceiling panels. In older elevators like this one, there's usually an access hatch, though it's typically locked or sealed. But as I stared upward, I noticed that one of the panels was slightly askew, creating a narrow gap of darkness. The voice was coming from there, floating down through that sliver of black space. I'm not particularly tall, but I managed to reach up and push against the loose panel. It shifted easily, more easily than it should have, as if it had been disturbed recently. The gap widened, and cool air flowed down onto my face, carrying with it a scent I couldn't identify. Something old and stale, like flowers left too long in water. The voice became clearer now. It was definitely a woman, and she was counting. Slowly, methodically, in a rhythm that didn't match any pattern I recognized. 7, 12, 3, 19. Each number was spoken with the same flat intonation, as if she were reading from a list, against every instinct screaming at me to stay put. I grabbed the edges of the ceiling opening and pulled myself up to peer through. What I saw above the elevator car defied everything I thought I knew about the building's layout. Instead of the narrow elevator shaft I expected, there was a vast space stretching in all directions, filled with a soft, gray light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The walls were covered in what looked like hundreds of elevator buttons, arranged in no pattern I could discern. Some glowed softly, others were dark, and a few flickered intermittently like dying stars. And there, standing on what appeared to be a platform suspended in this impossible space, was a woman in a faded blue dress. Her back was to me, and her gray hair hung limply to her shoulders. She was facing a wall covered entirely in buttons, and as I watched, she would reach out and press one, speak a number, then move to another button. Her movements were mechanical, repetitive, as if she'd been doing this for a very long time. I wanted to call out to her to ask for help, but something about her presence filled me with a dread so profound I could barely breathe. This woman didn't belong here. This space didn't belong here. None of this was possible, yet I was seeing it with my own eyes. The woman's counting continued, and I began to notice something disturbing about the numbers she was speaking. They weren't random. They corresponded to the buttons she was pressing, and those buttons, they were floor numbers, but not just any floor numbers. Some of them were impossibly high. 437, 812. 1003, but as if sensing my presence, the woman's counting stopped. Slowly, deliberately, she began to turn around. I didn't want to see her face. Every fiber of my being screamed that I should not see her face. I dropped back down into the elevator car, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. The ceiling panel slid back into place with a soft click that sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. The woman's voice resumed, but now it seemed closer, as if she were speaking directly above my head. The numbers came faster now, overlapping and blending into a stream of digits that made no sense. That's when the elevator lurched. It was a violent, sudden movement that threw me against the back wall. The lights went out completely, plunging me into absolute darkness. In that darkness, the woman's voice became a whisper, then a rustle, then nothing at all. The silence was complete and terrifying. Then, without warning, the elevator began to plummet. I pressed myself against the floor, bracing for impact as we fell past floor after floor. The descent seemed to last forever, far longer than it should have taken to reach the ground floor from the 15th. I counted the floors as we passed them, watching the numbers flash by in the dim emergency lighting that had flickered back to life. 14, 13, 12. But we didn't stop at 12. We kept falling 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and still we fell. The numbers on the display began showing things that shouldn't exist. Basement 1, basement 2, basement 3, but I knew this building didn't have 3 basement levels. It barely had one, just a small storage area and the parking garage. Finally, with a jarring thud that rattled my teeth, the elevator came to a stop. The doors opened immediately, revealing not the familiar marble lobby I expected, but a long, narrow corridor lined with doors. Each door was identical, painted the same institutional beige with a small window set at eye level. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. I didn't want to leave the elevator, but I also couldn't stay. The space behind me felt contaminated somehow, poisoned by whatever I had witnessed above. I stepped out into the corridor, and immediately the elevator doors slammed shut behind me with a finality that sent chills down my spine. The corridor stretched in both directions, seemingly without end. The doors along the walls were numbered, but not in any sequence that made sense. I saw door 847 next to door 23, followed by door 1205. The numbers seemed familiar, and with growing horror, I realized they matched some of the numbers the woman had been speaking. I approached the nearest door, number 23, and peered through the small window. Inside was what appeared to be an exact replica of my office, complete with my desk, my computer, even the coffee mug I'd left behind that evening. But sitting at my desk was a figure I couldn't quite make out, hunched over papers, working with mechanical precision. I moved to the next door, number 1205. This room contained what looked like my apartment, but wrong somehow. The furniture was arranged differently. The walls were painted a color I'd never chosen, and there was a person sleeping in my bed. A person who looked exactly like me but wasn't me. Door after door I found versions of spaces I knew, occupied by figures that resembled me but felt fundamentally wrong. Each room was a variation, a possibility, a life I might have lived but didn't. And in each room, the other version of myself went about their business, unaware they were being watched. I don't know how long I walked through that corridor. Time seemed meaningless there, flowing differently than it should. But eventually I found a door marked simply exit in plain black letters. I tried the handle, expecting it to be locked, but it opened easily. Beyond the door was a staircase, concrete and utilitarian, leading upward. I climbed those stairs for what felt like hours, my legs burning, my lungs struggling for air that tasted of dust and age. The stairwell was lined with the same fluorescent lights, and occasionally I would pass landing doors marked with letters instead of numbers. Door A, door M, door Q? I didn't dare look through their windows. Finally, I reached a door marked ground floor and pushed through it. I found myself in the familiar marble lobby of my office building, but it was wrong. The lighting was too bright, the shadows too sharp, and my reflection in the polished floor showed someone who looked exhausted, older, as if I'd aged years in the space of a few hours. The security guard at the front desk looked up as I approached. "Working late again, Mr. Thompson?" he asked, just as he did every night. But his smile didn't reach his eyes, and there was something in his expression that suggested he knew exactly where I'd been. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and walked out into the night. The city looked the same, but felt different, as if I were seeing it through glass. Even now, 3 years later, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not quite where I'm supposed to be. That somewhere in another room behind another numbered door, the real version of myself is still working late, still taking that elevator, still discovering what lies between the floors. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can hear her counting. The woman with the gray hair and the faded blue dress, pressing buttons in that impossible space above the elevator shaft, cataloging all the lives we might have lived, all the choices we never made, and sometimes, when I'm alone in elevators, I listen carefully between floors, hoping I won't hear that familiar whisper starting up again, beginning another count that never seems to end. If you're listening now, where are you from? What time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to know who's sharing this dark journey with me tonight. Now, let's slip into our next tale. Story Creaky, the night shift at Millbrook General. I used to work the night shift at Millbrook General Hospital, a sprawling complex built in the 1940s that had seen better decades. The pay was decent for a security guard, and I needed the money after my divorce. What I didn't expect was how the building itself would change after midnight, becoming something entirely different from the bustling medical center it was during the day. Millbrook General was a maze of interconnected wings, added over the years as the hospital expanded. The original building had that institutional charm of the mid-century, with wide hallways, high ceilings, and large windows that let in generous amounts of natural light during the day. But at night, those same hallways became corridors of shadow, and those windows turned into black mirrors reflecting the dim emergency lighting back at you with an unsettling intensity. My rounds took me through every section of the hospital: the main lobby, the emergency department, the surgical wing, the older psychiatric ward that had been mostly abandoned but never fully decommissioned, and the basement levels where the morgue and storage areas were located. Each area had its own personality after hours, its own particular brand of quiet unease. It was during my third week on the job that I first noticed the elevator in Wing C behaving strangely. Wing C was the oldest part of the hospital, and its elevator was an ancient thing with brass buttons and a manual gate that you had to slide shut before it would move. During my rounds, I would often hear it running when no one was supposed to be using it. The mechanical whir of the motor, the clank of the cables, the distinctive ding when it reached a floor. At first, I assumed it was maintenance or perhaps a doctor making late-night rounds. But when I investigated, I would find the elevator sitting empty at different floors, its brass gate standing open, the interior light casting a warm glow into the darkened hallway. The call buttons showed no recent activity, and there was never anyone around who might have used it. I mentioned this to Harrison, the day shift security supervisor, during our handoff meeting. He just chuckled and shook his head. "That old elevator's been doing that for years," he said. "Some quirk in the electrical system. Don't worry about it unless someone complains, but it bothered me. There was something purposeful about the way it moved. Something that suggested intention rather than malfunction. The elevator would run for exactly 3 minutes, stop at a floor for 30 seconds, then continue to another floor. Always the same pattern, always the same timing. It was too precise to be random, too consistent to be a simple electrical fault. After a month of hearing this nightly routine, curiosity got the better of me. Instead of just noting the sounds in my log, I decided to track the elevator's movements. I positioned myself at the central stairwell in Wing C, where I could hear it clearly and time its stops. What I discovered was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The elevator followed the same route every night. Starting at exactly 2:17 a.m., it would begin on the ground floor, rise to the 3rd floor and stop for 30 seconds, then continue to the 5th floor for another 30-second pause, then down to the 2nd floor, and finally return to the ground floor. The entire cycle took exactly 12 minutes, and then it would sit silent for the rest of the night. But here's what made it truly strange. The elevator was stopping at floors that didn't correspond to anything significant. The third floor was general medical, mostly empty patient rooms used for overflow. The fifth floor housed administrative offices that were locked and vacant after 6 p.m. The second floor was outpatient services, again completely shut down overnight. On a Thursday night in November, I decided to follow the elevator's routine more closely. I positioned myself on the ground floor of Wing C just before 2:17 a.m., watching the brass arrow above the elevator doors. Right on schedule, I heard the motor engage and the arrow began to move. But instead of just listening from a distance, I pressed the call button. The elevator stopped immediately. The motor went silent and the arrow froze between the first and second floors. I waited, expecting it to resume its climb, but nothing happened. Minutes passed. The building around me seemed to hold its breath, as if something had been interrupted, disturbed from its routine. I pressed the call button again, and this time I heard something that made my blood run cold. From inside the elevator shaft came a sound like someone knocking on metal. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, followed by a pause, then 3 more knocks. It wasn't the mechanical sound of cables or machinery. It was organic, purposeful, as if someone inside the elevator was trying to communicate. The knocking stopped, and the elevator resumed its ascent. I watched the arrow climb to the 3rd floor, where it paused for exactly 30 seconds, then continued to the 5th floor. But now I could hear something else accompanying the mechanical sounds. Footsteps. Soft, measured footsteps moving around inside the elevator car, as if someone was pacing back and forth in that small space. When the elevator returned to the ground floor and the doors opened, I was standing right there waiting. The car was empty, but it wasn't quite right. The air inside was warmer than it should have been, and there was a scent I couldn't identify. Something floral but old, like perfume that had been sitting in a bottle for decades. I stepped inside and immediately felt a presence that made my skin crawl. The brass buttons were warm to the touch, as if someone had been pressing them repeatedly. The floor showed scuff marks that hadn't been there before, circular patterns as if someone had indeed been pacing. I rode the elevator up to the 3rd floor, following the route I had observed. When the doors opened, the hallway stretched before me in dim emergency lighting lined with patient rooms that should have been empty. But as I walked down that corridor, I began to notice something that shouldn't have been there. Light was seeping out from under the doors of several rooms. Not the harsh fluorescent light of the hospital, but a softer, warmer glow, like lamplight. I approached the first room, number 314, and listened at the door. From inside came the faint sound of conversation, too muffled to make out words, but with the rhythm and cadence of people talking. I checked my master key card and slowly opened the door. The room was furnished not as a modern hospital room, but as a bedroom from decades past. There was a wooden bed frame with a floral bedspread, a matching dresser with an oval mirror, and a small table with a lamp that cast that warm golden light I had seen from the hallway. The walls were papered with a rose pattern that had faded to pale pink and cream, and in the bed, propped up against pillows, was an elderly woman in a white nightgown. She was knitting something with pale yellow yarn, her fingers moving with practiced precision. She looked up at me with eyes that were kind but somehow distant, as if she were seeing something beyond me. "You're not the night nurse," she said in a voice that carried a slight accent I couldn't place. "Are you here about the discharge papers?" I stood frozen in the doorway, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This room, this woman, none of it should exist. The 3rd floor was supposed to be empty, the rooms cleared of furniture and patients. Yet here was a scene that looked like it belonged in a different era, A different hospital entirely. I'm sorry, I managed to say. I think there's been some mistake. This floor is supposed to be vacant. The woman smiled, but it was a sad smile, tinged with something like pity. Oh dear, she said, never stopping her knitting. You're confused. This is 1967. I'm waiting for my daughter to pick me up. She said she'd be here by morning. 67. The year was printed on a small calendar sitting on the bedside table, and as I looked more carefully around the room, I noticed other details that supported what she was saying. The lamp was vintage, the telephone was an old rotary model, and the woman's clothing and hairstyle were definitely from that era. I backed out of the room and closed the door, my hands shaking. This was impossible. Whatever I had just witnessed, it couldn't be real. But as I walked down the hallway, I could see light coming from under more doors. Room 316, room 320, room 324. Each door hid another scene from the past. Another patient from decades ago who seemed to be waiting for something that might never come. I took the elevator to the 5th floor, continuing to follow the pattern I had observed. The administrative wing was supposed to be deserted, but as the doors opened, I could hear the sound of typewriters, dozens of them, clacking away in a rhythm that rose and fell like mechanical rainfall. The hallway was lined with office doors, each one marked with titles and names in a style of lettering that looked outdated. Dr. Edmund Harwick, Chief of Surgery. Nurse Margaret O'Sullivan, Head of Pediatrics. Administrator Dorothy Weinstein. Patient records. The names meant nothing to me, but they were etched into brass plates that looked worn with age. Through the frosted glass windows of the office doors, I could see silhouettes of people working. They moved with the efficiency of a busy day shift, but it was nearly 3 in the morning. I approached the nearest door and peered through the glass. A woman in a white nurse's cap was typing rapidly. Papers scattered across her desk, a cigarette burning in an ashtray beside her elbow. I knocked on the door, and she looked up. Her face was pleasant but tired, the face of someone who had been working long hours. She gestured for me to come in, so I tried the handle. The door was unlocked. "Can I help you?" she asked, looking at my security uniform with mild curiosity. "Are you the new night guard? I thought Mr. Peterson was working nights this week." "I'm sorry," I said, feeling like I was repeating myself. "But what year do you think this is?" She laughed, a sound that was musical but somehow hollow. What a strange question. "It's 1973, of course. November 15th, 1973. I'm trying to finish these discharge summaries before my shift ends. Would you mind closing the door?" The typewriter echoes in the hallway. I looked at her desk more carefully. The papers were indeed discharge summaries, but the names and dates were all from 1973. The typewriter was an old IBM Selectric, the kind my mother used to use when I was a child. Even the woman's clothing, a white uniform with a pointed collar and a small nursing pin, belonged to that era. I closed the door and backed away, my mind reeling. 2 floors, 2 different time periods, both playing out as if they were happening in real time. But they were memories, they had to be. Some kind of imprint left behind by decades of human activity in this building. The elevator took me to the 2nd floor, the final stop in its nightly routine. The outpatient services wing was different from the others. Instead of individual rooms or offices, it was configured as a series of waiting areas and examination rooms clustered around a central nursing station. During the day, it would be filled with patients waiting for appointments, children crying, the general chaos of a busy medical practice. But at night, it was something else entirely. The waiting area was full of people, but they weren't quite solid. They were translucent like images projected on smoke. I could see through them to the chairs and tables beyond, but they moved and interacted as if they were completely real. Families sat together. Children played with toys that made no sound. Elderly people read magazines that I couldn't quite make out. They were all waiting, just as they had waited decades ago for appointments, for news, for treatment. But their waiting had never ended. They were caught in an endless loop of anticipation, forever suspended in the moment before their names would be called. I walked through them, and occasionally one would look up at me with eyes that held a flicker of recognition, as if they almost remembered that they were supposed to be somewhere else, someone else. But then their gaze would drift away and they would return to their patient waiting. At the nursing station, a woman in a 1960s uniform was calling names from a clipboard, her voice echoing strangely in the space. "Mrs. Henderson, Dr. Morrison will see you now. Mr. Patterson, please update your insurance information. Thompson family, the doctor is running a few minutes behind." The names she called were answered by people who stood and walked toward examination rooms, but they moved like sleepwalkers, their actions mechanical and repetitive. I realized I was watching the same scene play out over and over. The same patients being called, the same responses, an endless cycle of medical routine from decades past. When the elevator returned to the ground floor, I was shaken but also strangely enlightened. Millbrook General wasn't just a hospital. It was a repository of human memory, a place where the echoes of countless lives and experiences had accumulated over the decades. The building itself had become a kind of storage device, preserving moments and people long after they had moved on. The elevator's nightly routine wasn't a malfunction. It was a service, a way of checking on these preserved memories, making sure they were still there, still playing out their eternal scenes. And somehow, by following that routine, I had become a witness to the hospital's hidden history. I never told anyone what I had seen that night. Who would believe it? But I continued working the night shift, and I learned to appreciate the elevator's routine. Sometimes, when I was feeling particularly lonely or disconnected from the world, I would follow it again, visiting those preserved moments from the past, spending time with people who had once filled these halls with life and purpose. The hospital finally closed 3 years later, deemed too old and too expensive to maintain. On my last night, I waited for the elevator's routine to begin, but 2:17 a.m. came and went in silence. The building knew its time was ending, and perhaps those preserved memories were finally ready to move on to whatever comes next. But sometimes, when I drive past the empty building that now stands where Millbrook General once was, I think I can see lights in the windows, warm and golden, and I wonder if somewhere, in some version of that place, the elevator is still making its rounds, still checking on the people who never really left. Story. First hit the house on Ridgemont Drive. I've been a real estate agent for 15 years, and in that time I've seen properties that would make most people uncomfortable. Houses where tragedies occurred, buildings with structural issues that gave them an unsettling atmosphere, places where the previous owners left behind an emotional residue that seemed to cling to the walls like smoke. But nothing in my experience prepared me for the house at 1247 Ridgemont Drive. The listing came to me on a gray Tuesday in October through our office manager, Sandra. She dropped the file on my desk with a thud that seemed heavier than the paperwork should have warranted. "This one's been sitting in our system for 8 months," she said, not meeting my eyes. "3 different agents have tried to show it. None of them will go back." I opened the file and immediately understood why the house had been difficult to sell. Built in 1962, it was a sprawling ranch-style home with over 4,000 square feet, situated on 2 acres of mature landscaping, in one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the city. The asking price was absurdly low, nearly 40% below market value for comparable properties in the area. In real estate, when something seems too good to be true, there's always a reason. The previous owners, the Hartwell family, had lived there for 37 years before putting it on the market. According to the notes in the file, they had moved out suddenly in March, relocating to Florida without explanation. They were handling the sale remotely through their attorney, and had specifically requested that showings be conducted only during daylight hours, never after sunset. The house itself looked normal enough in the photographs. Mid-century architecture with clean lines, large windows, and an open floor plan that should have been attractive to modern buyers. The kitchen had been updated within the last decade. The hardwood floors appeared to be in excellent condition, and the landscaping was mature and well-maintained. On paper, it was exactly the kind of property that should sell quickly in our market, but there were details in the file that gave me pause. The first agent's notes mentioned unusual acoustics and temperature inconsistencies. The second agent had written simply, "Client became uncomfortable. Terminated early." The third agent's notes were more detailed and considerably more unsettling. House exhibits unexplained phenomena. The client reported feeling watched. Sounds of movement when rooms are empty. Strong recommendation to disclose potential issues to future buyers. Despite these warnings, I was intrigued. Problem properties were often my specialty, and I had successfully sold houses with difficult histories before. Sometimes a property just needed the right approach, the right buyer, someone who could see past whatever psychological barriers were preventing a sale. I called the Hartwell family's attorney to schedule my first walkthrough. He was oddly formal during our brief conversation, insisting that I sign additional liability waivers beyond our standard forms, and repeatedly emphasizing that all showings must end before sunset. When I asked about the specific issues mentioned by previous agents, he became evasive, saying only that the property has some unique characteristics that sensitive individuals might find disturbing. I arrived at 1247 Ridgemont Drive on a Thursday afternoon in late October. The house sat at the end of a long, curved driveway lined with oak trees that had begun to turn their autumn colors. From the street, it looked like the perfect suburban family home, the kind of place where children would ride bicycles in the driveway, and families would have barbecues in the backyard. But as I walked up the front steps, I began to notice details that hadn't been apparent in the photographs. The windows, while large and numerous, were tinted more darkly than was typical for residential properties. The front door was unusually heavy, made of solid wood with multiple deadbolts that seemed excessive for a neighborhood with virtually no crime. The landscaping, while mature and well-maintained, was designed in a way that created numerous blind spots in areas where someone could easily hide from view. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The first thing that struck me was the silence. Not the normal quiet of an empty house, but an almost aggressive silence that seemed to push back against any sound I made. My footsteps on the hardwood floor echoed strangely, as if the sound were being absorbed and then released a few seconds later from a different direction. The living room was spacious and bright, with large windows overlooking the backyard. The furniture was still in place, covered with white sheets that gave everything a ghostly appearance. I walked through the room, making mental notes about the layout and features I would highlight to potential buyers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from the shadowed corners. The kitchen was impressive, with granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, and a large island perfect for food preparation or casual dining. But something was off about the lighting. Despite the abundance of natural light from the windows, the room felt dim, as if the light were being filtered through something that dulled its intensity. I checked the windows and found them clean and unobstructed, but the dimness persisted. As I moved through the house, I began to notice that each room had its own peculiar atmosphere. The master bedroom felt oppressively warm, even though the thermostat showed the same temperature as the rest of the house. The guest bathroom was inexplicably cold, cold enough that I could see my breath when I exhaled. The den had perfect acoustics for conversation, but when I spoke aloud to test the sound, my voice seemed to echo from rooms I hadn't been in yet. The basement was where things became truly unsettling. I descended the stairs slowly, noting that they were solid and well constructed, without the creaks and groans that usually accompanied older basement steps. The basement was finished with carpeted floors, wood-paneled walls, and recessed lighting that should have made it feel welcoming. Instead, it felt like descending into a place that was fundamentally wrong. The first thing I noticed was that the basement was larger than it should have been. Based on the footprint of the house above, the basement should have been roughly 2,000 square feet. But as I walked through the various rooms and corridors, it became clear that the space below was significantly larger than the space above. Rooms led to other rooms in configurations that didn't match the layout of the upper floors, and corridors extended in directions that should have taken me beyond the property boundaries. I tried to map the layout in my mind, but it was impossible. Each time I thought I understood the arrangement of the rooms, I would discover a doorway or hallway that shouldn't exist. It was as if the basement had been designed by someone who didn't understand how buildings were supposed to work, or who was intentionally trying to create a space that would disorient and confuse visitors. The rooms themselves were furnished, but not in a way that made sense for a family basement. There was a room that appeared to be set up as an office, but instead of a desk and chair, it contained only a single table with dozens of old photograph albums arranged in neat rows. Another room was configured like a child's bedroom, complete with toys and furniture, but everything was sized for a much smaller child than would typically live in a house like this. And the toys were all antiques, decades old and showing signs of extensive use. The most disturbing room was at the far end of a corridor that seemed to stretch much further than the property should have allowed. It was set up like a living room, with comfortable furniture arranged around a coffee table and a television, but the television was an old tube model from the 1970s, and it was on, displaying what appeared to be home movies of a family I didn't recognize. The family in the movies was gathered around a Christmas tree, opening presents and laughing, but their movements were slightly too slow. Their smiles held a fraction too long, and their laughter had a hollow quality that made my skin crawl. I stood in the doorway of that room for several minutes, watching the strange home movies play on the ancient television. The family looked happy, but there was something performative about their happiness, as if they were acting out the motions of joy without actually feeling it. And occasionally, one of them would look directly at the camera with an expression that was anything but joyful, a look of desperation or fear that flashed across their face before the artificial smile returned. As I watched, I began to realize that the home movies were playing in a loop, the same scenes repeating over and over with subtle variations. Sometimes the father would open a different present, sometimes the mother would sit in a different chair, but the basic structure of the scene remained the same. It was as if someone had filmed dozens of variations of the same Christmas morning, searching for the perfect version but never quite finding it. I turned to leave that room, and that's when I heard the footsteps above me. They were slow, deliberate footsteps, moving across the hardwood floors of the main level. I stood perfectly still, listening as someone walked through the living room into the kitchen, down the hallway toward the bedrooms. The footsteps were those of someone who was familiar with the house, someone who knew exactly where they were going and wasn't trying to hide their presence. But I was alone in the house. I had locked the front door behind me when I entered, and I hadn't heard anyone else arrive. The footsteps continued, methodical and purposeful, as if someone were conducting their own inspection of the property. I made my way back through the maze of basement rooms, trying to retrace my path to the stairs, but the layout seemed to have changed while I wasn't paying attention. Corridors that I remembered led to dead ends, and rooms that had been on my left were now on my right. It was as if the basement were rearranging itself, actively trying to prevent me from leaving. The footsteps above continued, and now I could hear other sounds as well. Cabinet doors opening and closing, the refrigerator being opened, the soft whoosh of faucets being turned on and off. Someone was moving through the house as if they lived there, going about their daily routine with complete familiarity. Finally, I found the stairs and climbed back to the main level. The sound stopped immediately as my head cleared the basement floor. The house was silent again. That same aggressive silence I had noticed when I first entered, but now it felt different, charged with tension, as if the silence were holding its breath. I walked through the main level, checking each room carefully. Everything was exactly as I had left it. The furniture still covered with white sheets, the windows still letting in that strangely filtered light. There was no sign that anyone else had been there, no evidence of the activities I had heard from the basement. But something had changed. The house felt more alive now, more aware of my presence. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, and I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, certain that someone was following me just outside my peripheral vision. I decided to check the second floor, which I hadn't yet explored. The staircase was elegant, with a curved banister and carpeted steps that muffled sound. As I climbed, I noticed that the family photographs lining the stairway wall showed the same family from the home movies in the basement, but the photos were arranged chronologically, showing the family aging over time. The parents grew older, their smiles becoming more forced, their eyes more hollow. The children grew up, but instead of the usual progression from childhood to adolescence to young adulthood, they seemed to grow more fearful with each passing year. In the most recent photographs, taken just before the family moved out, they all looked haunted, as if they had seen things that had fundamentally changed them. The second floor contained 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, all furnished but covered with the same white sheets as the rest of the house. But here, the sense of wrongness was even more pronounced. The hallway was longer than it should have been, stretching further than the exterior dimensions of the house would allow. The bedroom doors were all slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of furniture and belongings that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I entered the master bedroom, pulling back the sheet that covered the bed. Underneath was a king-sized mattress that looked relatively new, but the impression of 2 bodies was clearly visible in the memory foam, as if the previous owners had just gotten up moments before. The indentations were so pronounced that I could see exactly how they had slept. The husband on the left side curled into a defensive position, the wife on the right side lying rigidly straight, as if afraid to move. The master bathroom was the most disturbing room I had encountered yet. It was large and luxurious, with a jetted tub, a separate glass shower, and a long vanity with dual sinks. But covering every reflective surface, the mirrors, the shower glass, the chrome fixtures, were what appeared to be handprints. hundreds of them in various sizes, as if people had been pressing their palms against every shiny surface they could find. I approached the main mirror above the vanity and examined the handprints more closely. They weren't smudges or fingerprints, but actual impressions pressed into the surface of the glass, as if someone had pushed so hard that they had left permanent marks. Some were adult-sized. Others were smaller, child-sized, and a few were tiny, as if made by the hands of toddlers. But most disturbing of all, some of the handprints were pressed against the wrong side of the glass, as if someone inside the mirror had been trying to push their way out. I backed away from the mirror and noticed that my own reflection looked wrong. The lighting in the bathroom should have been even and flattering, but my reflection appeared wan and frightened, with shadows under my eyes and a pallor that made me look seriously ill. Even stranger, my reflection seemed to be moving slightly independently of my actual movements, lagging behind by a fraction of a second, as if it were trying to catch up with reality. The children's bedrooms were no better. Each one was frozen in time, with toys and clothes and personal belongings arranged as if the children had just stepped out for a moment. But the toys were the wrong kinds of toys. Vintage items that belonged to earlier decades, and they were arranged in patterns that suggested ritualistic behavior rather than play. Dolls were lined up in perfect rows, all facing the same direction. Board games were set up but never finished, with game pieces arranged in configurations that made no sense according to the rules. One bedroom contained what appeared to be art supplies, but instead of typical children's drawings, the walls were covered with hundreds of sketches of the house itself. The same views drawn over and over with obsessive precision. The front entrance, the living room windows, the backyard as seen from the kitchen, the basement stairs descending into darkness. Each drawing was slightly different, as if the child had been trying to capture something that kept changing, something that could never be drawn accurately enough to satisfy them. As I stood in that room, surrounded by hundreds of obsessive architectural drawings, I realized what I was looking at. These weren't the drawings of a child who was happy in their home. These were the drawings of someone who was trying to understand their environment, someone who was mapping escape routes or searching for hidden dangers. The child who had lived in this room had been afraid of their own house and had been trying to document that fear in the only way they knew how. I was ready to leave. Whatever was wrong with this house, it was beyond my ability to address or explain to potential buyers. This wasn't a matter of market positioning or creative staging. This was a property with fundamental problems that made it unsuitable for human habitation. But as I headed back toward the main staircase, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. The family photographs lining the stairway wall had changed. They were still showing the same family, but now they included an additional person, me. In every photograph, I was standing slightly behind the family members, always partially obscured by shadows or positioned at the very edge of the frame, but unmistakably present. In the earliest photographs, I looked normal, just someone who happened to be in the background. But as the chronological sequence progressed, I began to look more and more like the family members themselves, increasingly hollow-eyed, increasingly frightened, as if whatever had been affecting them was beginning to affect me as well. The most recent photograph, the one that should have shown the family just before they moved out, instead showed me standing alone in their living room, looking directly at the camera with the same haunted expression that had marked their later pictures. But this photograph couldn't exist. It was showing something that hadn't happened yet, something that was happening right now. I ran down the stairs and headed for the front door. no longer caring about conducting a professional inspection or gathering marketing materials. I just needed to get out of that house, away from whatever force was trying to incorporate me into its collection of victims. But the front door wouldn't open. I turned the deadbolts, pulled the handle, even threw my shoulder against the wood, but the door remained firmly sealed. The other exits were equally impassable. The back door was locked from the inside but wouldn't budge. The windows were sealed shut. Even the basement door that led to the outside was somehow blocked, despite appearing to be unobstructed. As I stood in the foyer, trying to understand how I had become trapped, I heard the footsteps again. But this time they weren't coming from above me, they were coming from all around me. The walls, the ceiling, even the floor beneath my feet seemed to be alive with the sound of people walking. Dozens of people moving through the house in patterns that made no architectural sense. The footsteps grew louder and more numerous, until it sounded like a crowd of people were marching through every room simultaneously. But the house remained visually empty, the white sheets still covering the furniture, the room still showing no sign of occupancy. Then the voices started. They were muffled, as if coming from behind closed doors or through thick walls, but I could make out fragments of conversation. A woman discussing grocery lists, a man talking about his work schedule, children arguing over television programs. Normal family conversations, the kind of everyday dialogue that fills any occupied house. But layered over these normal sounds were other voices, older voices, speaking in languages I didn't recognize and using words that seemed to belong to different time periods. I realized I was hearing the accumulated conversations of everyone who had ever lived in this house, all playing simultaneously, all trapped within the walls like echoes that had never been allowed to fade. The house was a repository of human experience. But unlike the hospital in my previous job, this one was actively collecting new memories, new voices to add to its ever-growing archive. And now it wanted to add mine. The white sheets covering the furniture began to move, not as if blown by wind, but as if the furniture underneath was shifting and changing shape. Gradually, the sheets fell away to reveal not the modern furniture I had expected, but pieces from different eras, different decorating schemes, different families who had lived here over the decades. A Victorian sofa sat next to a 1950s dinette set, which was positioned near a 1980s entertainment center that held a television from the 1970s. Each piece of furniture was exactly as it had been left by its previous owners, complete with the wear patterns and personal touches that marked it as someone's beloved possession. But now they were all here together, creating a museum of domestic life that spanned generations. I walked through this impossible collection, touching tables and chairs that felt solid and real, but represented the dreams and aspirations of families who had long since moved away or passed on. Some of the furniture still held personal items, reading glasses left on side tables, magazines folded open to articles that had been relevant decades ago, coffee cups with residue that had long since dried, but somehow still carried the faint scent of breakfast conversations from years past. In the center of this temporary museum, a new piece of furniture was materializing. A desk that I recognized as identical to the one in my real estate office. On its surface were files and paperwork that I knew belonged to my current clients, phone messages in my own handwriting, even a coffee mug with my agency's logo. The house was preparing a space for me, arranging a permanent exhibit of my own life and work. I don't know how long I wandered through that impossible collection of other people's lives. Time seemed to move differently inside the house, flowing in ways that allowed past and present to exist simultaneously. I found myself sitting in chairs that had belonged to families I had never met, reading books that had been left open to pages marked with grocery lists and phone numbers from decades ago, watching television programs on sets that showed not current broadcasts, but the favorite shows of previous residents, all playing at once in a cascade of overlapping entertainment from different eras. Eventually, I found myself in the kitchen where the table was set for dinner. Not just one dinner, but dozens of dinners from different time periods all laid out simultaneously. Place settings from the 1960s sat next to modern dishes which were positioned beside elegant china that belonged to an even earlier era. The food was there too, somehow fresh despite representing meals from across multiple decades. Pot roast from the 1970s, casseroles from the 1980s, organic vegetables from more recent years. And around this impossible table sat the transparent figures of everyone who had ever lived in the house, all sharing a meal that transcended time. They looked up at me as I entered the kitchen, their faces showing not fear or surprise but a kind of resigned welcome, as if they had been expecting me to join them eventually. The chair at the head of the table was empty, waiting for me. I understood then what the house wanted, what it had always wanted. It didn't just collect furniture and belongings and memories. It collected the people themselves, preserving them in a state of domestic routine that would never end. The families who had lived here hadn't really moved away. They were still here, still living their daily lives, still going through the motions of family, dinners and morning conversations, and bedtime stories for children who would never grow older than the moment they were absorbed into the house's eternal collection. The Hartwell family hadn't moved to Florida. They were sitting right there at the table, smiling at me with expressions that held both warmth and deep sadness. They had tried to escape, had fought against the house's influence for years, but in the end, they had joined the collection just like everyone else, and now it was my turn. But as I stood there, looking at that empty chair, and understanding what would happen if I sat down, I remembered something that none of the previous residents had known. I was a real estate agent. I had the legal authority to make decisions about this property. And I had an idea. I pulled out my cell phone, which somehow had full signal despite being inside a house that shouldn't allow communication with the outside world. I called my office and spoke to Sandra, telling her to immediately withdraw the listing for 1247 Ridgemont Drive and to contact the Hartwell family's attorney about arranging for the property to be donated to the city for conversion into a historical preservation site. But the family will lose a fortune if they don't sell, Sandra protested. Trust me, I said, looking at the transparent figures of the Hartwell family, who were nodding encouragingly. They'll be fine with it. The house shuddered around me as I ended the call. The furniture began to fade. The voices grew quieter and the oppressive atmosphere that had trapped me began to lift. By converting the house into a historical site, I had given it a new purpose. A legitimate reason to preserve the past without needing to trap living people inside its collection. The front door opened with a click, and late afternoon sunlight flooded into the foyer. I walked outside and stood on the front steps, breathing deeply of air that tasted normal again. Behind me, the house settled into quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet now, the satisfaction of a building that had found its proper role in the world. 6 months later, 1247 Ridgemont Drive opened as the Ridgemont Historical Museum. Specializing in domestic life across the decades, visitors often comment on how authentic the exhibits feel, how the furnished rooms make them feel as if they're stepping back in time to experience how families really lived in different eras. What they don't realize is that they are experiencing exactly that. The house still preserves its collection of families and memories and domestic routines, but now it shares them with the public, instead of trapping new victims. The Hartwell family and all the others are still there, still going about their daily lives, but now they're educational exhibits rather than prisoners. Sometimes, when I visit the museum, I can see them moving through the rooms, transparent but content, finally able to serve a purpose that doesn't require sacrifice. And in the guest book at the entrance, visitors often write comments about how the museum feels lived in and authentic, never realizing that it's both of those things in ways they could never imagine. The house got what it wanted, an eternal preservation of domestic life across the decades, but now it serves the living instead of consuming them. And everyone, both the visitors and the permanent residents, seems much happier with the arrangement. I still work in real estate, but I've become something of a specialist in unusual properties. Buildings with histories that need creative solutions rather than conventional sales. Because sometimes the best way to solve a problem isn't to fight it, but to find a way to turn it into something beneficial for everyone involved. Even when everyone involved includes people who technically no longer exist in the conventional sense of the word.